And let me just add, we have an election coming up, some might have heard, and it
Really?
might,
I didn't know about that. Who?
yeah, you'll hear about it.
Oh, really?
And this episode will be released, sometime around the election.
Okay.
And I suspect that some people may not feel as centered, as they might around that time. And I wonder if you can sort of comment on my question in that context.
I prefer to view politics not from the point of view of liberal or conservative, Republican, Democrat. I prefer to regard politics from the point of view of as a psychonaut. So for psychonauts, I recommend finding a few people who are also psychonauts or who are willing to do a medicine like MDMA with you and spend the day rolling with them.
Neuroscience, quantum physics, biology, plant medicine, non-dual tantric meditative practices. We will be exploring these concepts with experts to provide insights. Get ready to melt reality with us. Charley Winninger has been a psychotherapist in private practice since 1989. Licensed as a psychoanalyst as well as a mental health counselor, he specializes in relationships, communication skills, and nowadays focuses mostly on couples in his Brooklyn office. Charley completed his postgraduate training at the Gestalt Associates for Psychotherapy in New York and has continued his professional development the past 20 years in New York's Soma Psychic Institute, where he learned intuition and empathic attunement skills. And I can't wait to talk to Charley about all of that. For the past 20 years, Charley has been a member of the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, which funds research on the use of MDMA, ecstasy, for treatment of post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and other ailments. These days, Charley, who lectures on psychedelics across the lifespan, is considered an elder in the New York's underground psychedelic community, meaning he's had a life of a journey with psychedelics and a fair share of encounters with substances like LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, etc. Charley published an iconic book called Listening to Ecstasy in 2020. The publisher writes, in a world that keeps us separate from each other, MDMA is the chemical of connection. Aptly known in popular cultures as ecstasy, MDMA helps us rediscover our own true loving nature, often obscured by the traumas of life. On its way to becoming a prescription medication due to groundbreaking research on its use in treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, ecstasy can offer benefits for all of adult life stages from 20-something to seniors. Charley, it is just so wonderful to have you here. We're super excited for this conversation. And you and I, as I mentioned before, probably know a lot of the same iconic thought leaders and friends in the psychedelic space here in New York. And just to start, I'd like to explore a bit about your background, like your early background and what sparked you to become a psychotherapist, bona fide hippie from way back when. And we just would love to for you to share some of your early journey.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be on your podcast. Uh, my life is, I'm 75 now, and my growth has really been over the years through a combination of psychotherapy, meaning not only the psychotherapy I do, but the psychotherapy I'm in, that I've been in for most of my adult life, and psychedelics. And as a back in hippie times, Jody, you might remember there was an old phrase about you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And I always wanted to try my best to be part of the solution. And so at age 40, because wow, a long time ago now, I was working as an executive recruiter for the financial services industry, making more money than I knew what to do with, and feeling pretty hollow inside, and going through something of a midlife crisis. And decided at that point that I needed to make my life about something meaningful and to be part of the solution in the world. And that's when I decided to become a psychotherapist. And then I pulled out all the stops and went into debt, went back into school to go to school and stop work and all this. And never looked back. It was the best decision of my life. And so for the past 35 years, I've been a psychotherapist. But that's it in a nutshell. That's how I embarked on this journey. And I've always been using psychedelic substances from about 1970 to today. And of course, saw it from its first high point in the late 60s, early 70s, to the dark ages of the drug war, when we were all pretty much driven underground. And then, of course, the current renaissance in the past 15, 20 years, which has been exhilarating for me. I never thought I'd live to see the day where states are decriminalizing or legalizing these substances for personal use. So these are quite thrilling times.
That's perfect, and that sort of launches us off, and we'll certainly get more into using psychedelics in therapy. But before we get into that, talk to us a little bit about intuition and empathetic attunement therapy and the skills that you use in your psychotherapy, I guess with or without the use of psychedelic drugs.
Yeah, I don't use the medicines in the therapy I do, though I look forward to the time when I can do so and be open about it, and without fear of being thrown out of the profession or worse. But I've been trained in empathic attunement skills, which simply means learning how to access my intuition when doing a session. So it's really related to and dovetails very nicely with my medicine journeys. I've done MDMA, which is my medicine of choice, about 90 times now, over the past 20 years or so.
Wow.
And over time, it's had a cumulative effect on me. And one way it has is by helping me develop my ability to empathize, which, of course, as a therapist is pretty is quite useful. So what I try to do in my sober therapy sessions is replicate as much as possible the feeling for the client. I prefer the term client to patient because client is more peer-to-peer. The feeling of that one might have when rolling on MDMA. In other words, to give them an experience of safety and well-being as much as I can, by being not only a receptive and dedicated listener, but one who is empathic and who is receiving them in a profound and open-hearted way, because the quality of my presence is really the most important part of the therapy that I give, more important than any techniques or I may use or theory I might pull from. It's the quality of my presence that matters. So that's how I approach the therapy.
And so that's fantastic. I know that you've been working with and known and have a friendship with Rick Doblin from MAPS for many years. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about how that started and what your work has been with him over these years.
Okay, well, I've been, as you pointed out in my bio there, I've been a member of MAPS for a long, long time. And back in 2004, MAPS sent out, I believe Rick wrote this email to all of us saying there's going to be a documentary shown on ABC News called Ecstasy Rising. And would we be willing to host a screening in our home? So we raised our electronic hand and said, sure, but you have to send people to our home because we don't know anybody in the community. Everyone is sort of in the closet. So they reached out to the people in our zip code areas, and we ended up with about 10 people in our apartment to watch this documentary, which was a revelation. The the anchor of ABC News was hosting, and he said that MDMA, the government's case is really against it. It's really doesn't hold water. It's really kind of safe, and even though it's unregulated and there's some bad batches around, but statistically, it's really kind of safe. And Rick Doblin was interviewed for the interview for the documentary, and that's how I really started collaborating, if you will, with him. That was the beginning of Shelley, my wife Shelley, and I building the psychedelic community in New York City. Those 10 people ended up, they all brought food for the night. It was our first potluck. This December, we're going to host our 21st potluck here in
Wow.
Manhattan, with for around, well, we're going over, having it over 2 nights at a hall that we're renting, and 50 people a night. So we've been building the psychedelic community and collaborating with Rick all this time.
So, all right. So, as many in our audience may know, MAPS sought approval from the FDA fairly recently for a therapy combining MDMA with psychotherapy to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. And the FDA declined to approve the application and really requested additional clinical trials, et cetera, et cetera. A day later, one of the journals retracted a bunch of papers of the company's earlier clinical studies. So, can you give us your view, your insight as to what happened at the FDA advisory committee, but not from a deep technical perspective, but broadly speaking, what would you say, caused them to be spooked, I guess, by the therapy and to fail to
Okay, so there's what caused them to be spooked, and it caused the FDA to be spooked. The advisory committee was mostly made up of people who admitted at that meeting that they know very little about psychedelics, and they gave the mic over to people who are not only critical but were pointing out some real flaws. The sexual abuse of one therapist in the clinical study from back in 2017, I think, who MAPS, when they found out, they threw him out and tried to make amends with the woman who pretty much me too'd the therapist. Of course, that was a bad apple in the 100 or so researchers. This was a terrible person. And some other problems like with double blinding the research, which is bogus. You can't ever double blind a psychedelic drug for research. But anyway, they pointed to some flaws in the research, some of which I believe were valid, some of which were not. And in my mind, it was like pointing to some bad trees and saying, we're cutting the whole forest down. And the result is, unfortunately, people are going to die, or I should say, continue to die, the most uh,
And suffer.
and suffer, the most
Suffer.
horrific,
Right.
one of the most horrific statistics that we live with in America is that between 17 and 20 veterans die each day by their own hand,
Hmm.
and most of them suffer from PTSD and its ramifications.
Yeah, and let me just make a comment before we sort of move on from this. I mean, as a regulatory consultant, I work in the space. We help companies get through FDA advisory committee. And
Mm,
it's just interesting what you said. And I think you're right. They didn't have experience with psychedelics. It's not their job to have had experience. It's their job to evaluate the available data. That a company coming to the FDA comes with a new chemical entity. This is not a new chemical entity, right? We've known about it. But typically an advisory committee is confronted with a new chemical entity that the world has never been seen before. That's why they're
yeah,
evaluating it, and they're supposed to look at the data and make a decision as to whether it's safe and effective. And
that's right.
this has so much history and so much baggage behind it that they weren't really doing the job the way they were supposed to.
That's right. And the FDA was spooked by the opioid crisis, and
Right.
they didn't want to make the same mistake again. So when their advisory committee said thumbs down, they didn't want to go against that. Even though 80 members of Congress, I think it was 19 senators and 61 congresspeople, were lobbying the FDA to please, mostly because of the veterans who are desperate, said, please approve this. But they said no. And another reason they said no is because the protocol called for not just using MDMA, but using MDMA interspersed with a whole lot of psychotherapy. And the FDA said, well, we don't regulate psychotherapy, we regulate
Right.
medicine.
Right.
But they knew this going in. They knew this when they
Right.
approved the study protocol. So
Right.
this, the real truth, I believe, David and Jody, is that MDMA and psychedelics in general are paradigm busting medicines. And for science is going to have to, yeah, there has to be shown to be safe and effective, absolutely. But science is going to have to expand the idea and the FDA is going to have to expand the idea of what medicines are appropriate, because this medicine, for it to have the most good, to do the most good, has to be done in conjunction with psychotherapy, and that's how you get the best results.
Agree 100%. So let's hover on MDMA for a moment, and then we'll sort of move on to some other topics. But just why don't you talk to us a little bit about, and again, not in a great deal of technical detail, but give us a sense of broadly what your understanding is as to how MDA affects the brain to bring about this state of ecstasy. What is it broadly doing, again, for a layperson to
Sure.
understand?
MDMA, basically what it does is releases uh, an uncanny cocktail of hormones in your body. Serotonin, which is the feel-good hormone and the feel-safe hormone, and oxytocin, which is a bonding hormone where you feel bonded. That's why you can't double blind the study, because a therapist, the clinician doing the study is going to know that their patient is on MDMA. Why? Because after the medicine comes on, the patient invariably sits up in the bed and says, "So how are you doing, doctor?" Because they're full of empathy. So it increases your feelings of empathy and connectedness and safety and well-being, all those hormones. A very powerful cocktail, and to be found in no other medicine that I know of. And so what that does is can open you up, and if you're suffering from PTSD, it can alter. You can revisit the trauma in a way that, as one person put it, it's like watching a shark in a tank. You can see it and with all its horror, but you're safe. And it permanently alters your perception and your relationship to the trauma. And so, and for other people, it can just, it opens the heart, and that's why it's so good for couples therapy. They say you can do a year's worth of couples therapy in a day with the proper preparation before and integration after, because the people their hearts are open and they can speak from their heart and say what they want to say and hear what their partner wants you to hear, what your partner wants you to hear in a way that you might not have been receptive to before, because this medicine temporarily lowers your ego defenses. So if you can get heart-to-heart open communication, so that's why it can be so effective.
So with that in mind, of course, the word ecstasy is describes a state of consciousness, and yogis have used the word, ecstatic states and things like that. Could you describe the experience as a softening of the intellect, so that besides this heart opening, what might a person see or feel or hear who hasn't done this before? And can you describe that what is the quality of ecstasy? Is it the opening of the heart and the dissolving of trauma, where it's just more of a quality of love and presence? Like, can you describe the experience a little bit more?
Sure, as best as I can. One of the best definitions I heard is, it feels like the sun itself is rising in my heart, one person said. It's and it, you mentioned, about what you see and hear. I need to emphasize this is not a hallucinogen. So you see what you see now, and you hear what you hear now. Your auditory and optical senses are not changed, but you do feel differently, and that can be an emotional and physical sensation, mostly centered around the chest, of a warmth, sort of a glowing feeling in your chest, outward into your extremities, and a basic feeling of well-being. Chemically, it's related to amphetamine. It is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. And it's not amphetamine. It's not the same. Amphetamine is addictive and will make you jittery and has a horrible come down if you use it wrongly. And that's not true with MDMA if you use it correctly. But it's similar in that it gives you a glowing feeling of well-being and stimulates the senses. And so it can be considered a love drug.
Lovely.
And a sensual drug. Not, some people say it's a sex drug. That's not my experience. It's not my wife's experience. And but it is a sensual drug.
So with that in mind, I was just wondering, because you don't use substances in your therapeutic practices now, are there other modalities that you work with in your own practice with clients that help them open their heart in ways that could not be parallel to ecstasy, but actually transformative?
Well, the best way I know is what I described before, by being a good presence for them, and letting them know by reflecting back to them what I'm hearing them say and the emotion that I'm seeing with them, letting them know that I'm really here and I'm really seeing them as best as I can, and hearing them and giving them the experience of that. And when I do that, and when anyone does that for somebody and it can be such a dedicated listener, it tends to lower their defenses and open them up, and they can feel seen and heard and safe, and that can be healing because then um, they can open and keep talking so that they can eventually access their own wisdom and learn their own solutions to their problems.
Let's talk a little bit about self-guided or maybe recreational use of psychedelics, and your view of what you think about, this activity. Some call it being a psychonaut. I think you referred to that before. But also if you think this could be therapeutic, not even from a psychiatric sense, but just from a sense of well-being, a sense of feeling good in the world, a sense of right centering people. And let me just add, we have an election coming up, some might have heard. And it
Really,
might,
I didn't know about that. Who?
yeah, you'll hear about it.
Oh, really?
And this episode will be released, sometime around the election.
Okay.
And I suspect that some people may not feel as centered, as they might around that time. And I wonder if you can sort of comment on my question in that context.
Okay. Well, those are two different questions. Let me answer the first one first. Um, uh, Better than calling it recreational use, I prefer the term celebrational. And I believe that the celebrational use of MDMA can, if it's used correctly with the right protocols and you know what you're doing, because if you don't know what you're doing, you shouldn't do this drug, the powerful psychoactive agent. But if you educate yourself and learn how to do it right, um, the celebrational use with others or with others at a rave or others at a party or others in your home for the day can be transformational. Play, fun, and joy can be transformational. And I really believe that, and I live that, and as best as I can. And this medicine can be an agent for transformation. So moving along to the second part of your question about the times we live in, I've done a lot of thinking about it. I'm very much as an old member of the counterculture and politically been politically aware all my adult life and very much concerned about what's happening to our country and realizing that and I learned this the hard way from taking vehement stands with people that I disagree with. It doesn't work. It can be fun or satisfying temporarily to get righteously angry or indignant at somebody who's voting for the other person. But it doesn't convert the other person. I mean, have you noticed that arguing tends not to work? And so I prefer to view politics not from the point of view of liberal or conservative, Republican, Democrat. I prefer to regard politics from the point of view of as a psychonaut. And what psychedelics have taught me is that we're all really the same here. Yeah, we have different opinions, but we have more in common than we have differences, and our commonality is more important and significant than our differences. And we need to recognize what we call the other. We need to de-other them, or we need to recognize that we have more in common with them than we might want to admit. So, and also, Okay, so in that same line of thinking, I believe that that action is called for, but not the typical type of political action where you're protesting in the streets and chanting and throwing things perhaps and cursing people on the other side. I think that's just adding more fuel to the fire, and this country has enough of that. We need to be looking at what can unite us. So for psychonauts, I recommend finding a few people who are also psychonauts or who are willing to do a medicine like MDMA with you and spend the day rolling with them. We call like LSD is a trip, MDMA is a roll, and spend the day rolling with them with one rule: no political talk.
Mm. Mm.
And the purpose of that is to undemonize them in each other's eyes and to realize that how human that person is and how much you really have in common, not just a love of the same medicine, perhaps, but that you can meet on a heart-to-heart level. That's a kind of action that we need to take in our culture, because I believe this medicine has the potential for true healing on a massive scale. And it's important. I have more to say unless.
Of course, yeah.
Okay. Because I think a lot about this type of stuff. We're beset by gargantuan challenges, not just the political divide, but global warming, wars all over the damn place. It's scary times, challenging times. And I'm reminded of an old quote that you cannot keep the bird of misfortune from flying over your head, but you can keep it from making a nest in your hair.
Right.
Wonderful.
And what this means is that we can get caught in anger, indignation, despair, grief, all of this. And some of these emotions we need to process. But we need to take action, because action is the antidote to despair and a feeling of helplessness. And I believe the kind of action we need to take is one that comes out of not reactivity, but responsiveness. There's a difference between reacting and responding. Reacting, as we know, is reacting to somebody who we disagree with fear, anger, rage, judgment. Those are reactions. A response is a more evolved way to do it. It's difficult. It's more difficult, especially these times. But it's what's called for in these challenging times. I think that's what we're being challenged to do. And the best definition of responsibility I ever heard is response ability, the ability to respond. And I believe that's what's called for, and to come from the psychedelic vision that calls us to recognize each other as brothers and sisters, that tends to have us stand outside our egos and our political positions, and to what pulls us together as fellow humans. And that means really understanding that this separation that we use to judge each other is really an illusion, that we're really, like it or not, very much similar. And so in this way, we need to think of what kind of action to take from that place of responsibility.
That's great, and it's a great segue to my next and last question, and that is, I think I refer to sort of most of your answer as what I would call ego activation, right? ego reactivity, ego, you know, and we always ask our guests about their views on the ego. And I think it's a perfect sort of segue to that. And from your perspective, what is the ego and how does it benefit or disrupt a person's life? What do you have to say
Wow.
about the ego, broadly speaking?
Okay. Well, it's certainly both. I mean, it benefits and disrupts. You really couldn't effectively navigate the world without an ego. You'd be crushed. And you need an ego to navigate reality, to draw boundaries, healthy boundaries with people, to be able to say no in an authentic way or yes in an authentic way. Uh, the ego is a part of us that regulates behavior, that um, synthesizes our impulses on one end and our conscience on the other end, and forges them. I'm talking about old Freudian concepts here, but it forges a middle path between conscience and id, and and makes us construct a personality um, from our history and from our values, hopefully, with which we present ourselves to the world and find our place in it, and do our jobs um, and relate to each other. And so it's you wouldn't want to get rid of your ego. You'd be useless as a human being, really, unless you were enlightened and a guru, and then you could be of use. But there aren't too many of us who can come from that point of view. Uh, and so the ego can be useful, but it needs to be tamed. And you need to ride the horse, otherwise to tame that horse. Otherwise, it's going to ride off with you in all kinds of narcissistic directions, and make you insufferable to those around you. And the use of medicines like MDMA or LSD or psilocybin, especially when and only when used with knowledge and respect for their power and understanding how to use them correctly, these medicines temporarily dissolve the ego so that something deeper can emerge, what they call the self, to use, for lack of a better term, a capital S, self, which is the part of us that's really the part of everything. That's the part of me that's connected to you and also connected to nature and also connected to the divine. And that's the self. And so there's a dance that we do, or I try to do, between the self and the ego, and knowing when to access one or the other. And these medicines tend to remind me that I actually have a self, that I don't have to get lost in my internal dialogue, all these conflicts that I have, or emotions that I struggle with, and all this. When I'm on MDMA for the day, for example, the chattering monkeys in my brain quiet down. What a blessed relief. Those monkeys that are always judging, evaluating, conniving, or whatever they're doing to try to manipulate the environment to get the best results for me, all those quiet down for the day. And something deeper in me can emerge. And so I can make a heart-to-heart connection with others, which is so blissfully healing, and in a way that lasts, because I say this medicine has a cumulative effect over time. So Hope I'm answering your question.
Oh, beautiful. Oh, Charlie. It's they describe it as a spectrum from a very thinly veiled ego to a quality of egolessness, like the great yogis,
Hmm.
who functioned without so much of the mind, intellect, and ego, to a quality of a concretized ego where judgment and narcissism and identity
Yes.
exist.
Right.
And there's some beautiful traditions and practices like Kashmir Shaivism and non-dual tantra that can sort of play with perception, identity of the ego, and play with one's concretized um, experience. We always bring history and memory to everything we see.
Hmm.
Certain yogic practices uh, play with what we see and disrupt our history and memory, allowing the intellect just to relax, just
Yes.
let go. And then there's this quality, this what I call the arising of experience, the spark of the sensory self arising. And so I do think that certain psychedelics enable that experience, and certain yogic practices enable
Hmm.
that experience.
Hmm.
And that's what we're exploring here at Exploring Reality Maybe, are these there's a beautiful intersection between neuroscience, quantum physics, tantra, and these beautiful plant medicines that say
Hmm.
that the mind, intellect, and ego are important tools, but we need to grab, I call it the wild horse stallions of our brain. We need to gain some gentle, kind firmness
Yes.
and not allow the negative spinning mind to run the show.
Yes.
So I totally agree with what you say, and I think that that heart opening, that love quality, that ecstatic quality of being in the moment as a precious being is really the North Star for this conversation.
Yes. And to arrive in that place, I say the way I do it is with my medicine practice. I practiced using the medicine, and to arrive in that place of just the moment, without all that other crap to block my view, and to all that static falls away, like memory and personality and all that. So I can just arrive as a being with other beings. It's just that's ecstatic to me,
Yes.
and can be transformative.
So beautiful. So what is next for you, Charlie, in this beautiful work and journey, and with your work with clients and your with your partners, and your work with bringing this sort of love formula out into the world? What's next for you?
What's next for me is what I've been doing for the last several years, is hosting group experiences with
Mm,
this medicine.
mm,
And MDMA is a very uh, versatile medicine. Uh, a dose of 120 milligrams with the right therapy can, on one end of the spectrum of use of this medicine, can be used to heal the most horrifying PTSD, the most horrifying memories that can cripple a person. The same dosage, the same stat, can also be used on the other end of the spectrum of use to rave the night away with 1,000 others in wild abandon. What I've developed is the middle ground between these two poles. I call it serious fun,
okay.
where we get together with people who I'm very selective about who I choose for these experiences. And we get together for the day and spend the day together rolling on MDMA, either in the park if the weather's beautiful, or indoors if it's wintertime, and reach each other, meet each other in a profound way. And there's some structure to it, but mostly it's just about people lying about in groups of twos and threes and fours and fives, talking, but talking from their heart and hearing and receiving the people around them in ways that are extraordinary and unique. And so when we do it in the park, it looks to outsiders like a bunch of people sitting around on blankets having a picnic, except for the occasional cuddle puddle. But what's really happening is something quite profound, and people come away from these experiences saying that this is not only the highlight of their year, but for some people, it's one of the highlights of their life. And people meet each other and form bonds and friendships from these experiences that last years. So this is an unexplored or underexplored use of this medicine, and that's really the future of my work.
Incredible. Well, for our listeners, you can go onto our show notes and learn about listening to Ecstasy, learn about how to read Listening to Ecstasy, Charley's book, his website, his contact information. Charley, it has been just so wonderful being here today with you. And we're so grateful for your experience, your journey, and sharing your knowledge with our community.
Well, thank you. Yes, you can find me, actually, if I may say, just listeningtoecstasy.com. That's how you find my website. And it's been a pleasure to speak with the two of you today, and an honor. So I really, really appreciate it.
Miraculix is a small and independent company that has created the first quantifiable home test called Q-Test for anyone taking mushrooms or psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, and any other psychoactive substance. So think about this. You're at home, you're with friends, you're hanging out, and you're experimenting with these amazing psychoactive plant medicines, and yet you don't really know the dosage. Miraculix is here to help you really have a positive experience so that you don't overdose. Created by Dr. Felix Bell of Germany, please go on our show notes and order this package. They're now available in the USA, and we couldn't be more excited to represent this home kit, because we want you to have a truly positive experience with psychoactives to explore your own reality and the way these psychoactives can help you in your life.
Exploring Reality Maybe is written, produced, fact-checked, and edited by Jody R. Weiss and David Schwartz. Research support is provided by Semicolon Connects. Music produced by Nextbox. Visit our website at exploringrealitymaybe.org to find show notes, transcripts, bios, and to learn more. If you like the show, please visit our website to donate.